who is against decriminalisation, and Ant Lehane of the organisation Voltfast Drugs, who supports it. Let's go to Peter first. Peter, we've just been having a little chat in the studio here about different approaches taken around the world and whether it might be time to say that our approach clearly isn't working. Is it time to decriminalise? What do you think about that?
Well, it's a non sequitur. Our approach has been since 1967 to decriminalise by stealth. And that's what's happened ever since the Wooten report recommended it to the then Labour government, which put the 1971 misuse of drugs bill through, nearly got it through, and then the Tory government took it up and put it through again. It fundamentally ended any serious attempt to prosecute or punish the possession of drugs, and it's incidentally also gave marijuana a special status where it was treated as if it didn't matter and was soft, which is very odd given its increasing correlation with severe mental illness. No, there's no suggestion at all that carrying on this policy or intensifying it or making it formal will make things any better. If we go the next step and legalise drugs, what will happen is they will be sold openly in the street and advertised on television, which I don't think would help anything at all. If you're looking for alternatives to how we behave, you can look particularly to two highly civilised, law-governed, advanced economic powers, Japan and South Korea, both of which still prosecute the possession of drugs and as a result have a great deal less drug abuse in their societies. This is also what we used to do before 1967, when the abuse of drugs in our society was much less before then. But the general softening up since then and the almost total penetration of the chattering classes, not surprisingly, since so many of them spent their university years in the 60s and the 70s lying about on college lawns smoking dope. The total penetration of those classes by the legalisation mantra means it's very hard to argue against it. But the truth is, practically, that if you want to stop people from using drugs, you have to deter them from doing so. And the best way to do that is to have real pursuit of a policy of punishing possession, which is what we don't do. We try to control supply without any way trying to interdict demand, and it doesn't work.
OK, Peter. Ant Lehane from Voltfast Drugs, what have you got to say about that?
I don't buy Peter's argument about South Korea and Japan being models that we should follow. I do not think that there is any evidence to suggest that deterring people further from using drugs has any meaningful impact on usage. You look at Duterte in the Philippines, who's killed hundreds of people because of drugs, and that has not stopped people using drugs. Furthermore, Japan and South Korea are very different cultures to our own. We have very different cultural norms than they do. I also would like to separate the point around decriminalisation of possession and legalisation, as they're often conflated quite a lot. The current approach, as you rightly say, after 50 years, it's not working. Usage rates are through the roof exponentially. Drug deaths are rising. It's been year-on-year increases now for, I think, 7 years. In that time, drug treatment budgets have been decimated and slashed. So it's not just about decriminalisation of possession, but why Portugal works so well is that there was a raft of measures brought in to not only decriminalise possession, which does nothing to help that, but also to give wraparound care to, as you said, heroin-assisted treatment does actually exist in this country. The evidence base is really strong for all of this. We're not doing anything that radical. In certain parts of the United Kingdom, we have decriminalisation of possession sort of by stealth, and that's because police and crime commissioners have seen that there is absolutely no point in prosecuting people for drug usage because it does absolutely nothing. It furthers the cycle of criminalisation, and it's a proven failure. There's very few areas of policy I think that have been such a big unmitigated disaster as the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's horrific.
But would you say that you agree with Peter when it comes to more of a crackdown on the supply of drugs?
I think that there are some very evil gangs who currently run the drug market, but I think the way to undermine them is through, again, policy reform. So, for example, the cohort of heroin users in this country is pretty small. That's why heroin-assisted treatment works, because actually, if you can eradicate heroin users heroin dealers by giving them the supply they need, they won't commit a crime. Equally, you're putting the dealers out of business. Now, that wouldn't work for something like cannabis, which has a number of users. There is also an evidence base to talk about regulating cannabis, and that's worked in Canada. I don't think what Peter's saying about seeing it advertised on the television is ever going to happen. You don't see that with tobacco, for example, so I'm not really sure where that's come from.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, looking at, let's take cannabis as an example. I mean, I've noticed walking around London, it smells like you're at a frat party most of the time. But, you know, from other countries that have made the move to legalise cannabis, I mean, let's take, for example, the Netherlands. I've been to the Netherlands a lot, and it doesn't seem to me that these people are walking around in a zombified state with lots of mental health issues. Would a drug like cannabis maybe benefit from legalisation? Or is your approach that every single drug currently classified as a criminal offence to possess and use should actually be, you know, that legislation should be strengthened?
Well, I'm sorry, my main point has been completely ignored and pushed to one side by my opponent. He changed the subject when I mentioned Japan and South Korea and immediately switched it to the Philippines and President Duterte, whose policies I don't recommend and rather despise. It is demonstrably so. Indeed, a recent Home Office report on the use of drugs accepted that use of drugs in Japan was significantly lower than here. But they also adopted this rather racist view that they are different cultures in some way from us and can't do it. They're not different cultures. They simply do what we used to do when we still had a grip on it. The whole issue has been, and it goes back in terms of the police behavior, to well before the Runciman report at the turn of the century and the Paddock experiments in South London. But the police and the courts, ever since Lord Hailsham, that well-known Trotskyist, as Lord Chancellor in 1973, told magistrates to stop sending people to prison for possession of marijuana, the guts have been taken out of any attempt to control the use of marijuana. I wasn't calling for a crackdown on dealers. I mean, it's obviously important to prosecute and punish people who sell drugs, but there's absolutely no point in doing that without controlling demand. And demand is best controlled by prosecuting those who use and possess the drugs. And that is what we will not do. But it's idle and false to claim that this policy is not practical, could not be used, and doesn't work, because it does. All the rest of it is the same old drug legalization boilerplate. And where do I get advertising of drugs on television from? I get it from Proposition 64, recently voted through in California by pro-cannabis billionaire campaigners, which allows for the advertising of marijuana and is quite clearly part of the intention of those. And also we get this casual mention of Portugal. Portugal simply formalized the fact that it did very little about drugs in the first place. It was very weak on prosecuting. Lifetime use of drugs in many cases has increased in Portugal since the laws have further weakened. The Portuguese drug paradise, if examined, is mythical. The mayor of Porto, the second largest city in Portugal, recently called for the reinstatement of laws against drugs because so much damage was being done by drug abuse. It goes on and on, this stuff. And we're told Canada and Colorado, they've legalized it. Well, they did indeed legalize marijuana.
Okay,
And
Peter,
we were told before this legalization would sideline the gangs and mean that criminal activity in drugs would be removed. On the contrary, precisely because the drug was legalized and then became subject to taxation, the illegal suppliers redoubled their efforts and continue to flourish in both Canada and Colorado. And all the promises of the legalizers about this turned out to be untrue. Meanwhile, the instance of severe mental illness among marijuana users, they say it's correlation, no one's proved causality, continues to be so.
Peter,
and if you go to a fascinating website,
we've got very limited time, Peter. Can we just let Anne respond to that, please? Anne, can you please respond to that?
I'd love to. Thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me in. What I would like to say is I can't find any evidence to back up what Peter's saying. If you look at the United States, Peter, please let me speak. If you look at the United States,
Peter, you've had a really good say, Peter, and we've got a limited amount of time. I'm really sorry, we've got a limited amount of time.
I haven't finished. I have a very important point to make, and I would like to let Anne respond. When I've made it, I'll finish.
Come on, Peter, it's a debate. We can have a discussion here.
I cannot ever get this case out. I'm the only person who makes it on British television. There's a very excellent website called Attack at Smoked Cannabis, where you can examine the huge numbers of crimes committed by people who are
okay, Peter, so can we let Anne respond to that website? You mentioned the website. Just let Anne respond to that, please.
Okay, so first and foremost, I'll get through it as quickly as possible because I know Peter's taken up a good amount of time. Trying to crack down on drug users has not worked. In the United States, where there was a 3-strike policy in the 1990s, there are still people serving 20-year sentences for the possession of cannabis. I cannot find anywhere that, the evidence shows that locking people up works. Equally, if it did work, where are we going to find the money in the criminal justice system to lock up a load of cannabis users? It's nonsensical. On the point about attacker smoked cannabis, it's selectively picked a load of articles where there's any link between violence and cannabis, and the sort of central premise to that is that people who smoke cannabis are going to go out and commit violent murders, and I just do not think there is any evidence base to that whatsoever.
Is it not the case, actually, that you might find more mental health issues among people who take drugs, because actually it's whether the chicken or the egg comes first. They have mental health issues, which is why they may resort to taking drugs.
Absolutely, and I think this is where we need to continue to do some research, even on the the schizophrenia point with cannabis, for example. I think the science is pretty clear that if you smoke cannabis from a young age, it can have a deleterious effect on your mental health if you are predisposed to that. But signs of schizophrenia tend to show later in life. So if someone is mentally unwell, they might go and reach to a drug beforehand to try and deal with the mental health issues, to self-medicate. And there's a big link between adverse childhood trauma. So these aren't hedonists who've gone out to, just decide that they want to destroy their lives. They're people who tend to be suffering, who need help, and our mental health services have been cut, our drug treatment services have been cut, and there's been a huge rise in drug deaths.
So before we go back to Peter, what would be your solution to this problem? If you can give it in a nutshell in terms of, decriminalisation, legalisation, which drugs, treatment programmes, try and sort of give us a sort of brief overall
Wrap
picture,
around, sure.
if you can, yeah.
Okay, so decriminalisation of possession of all drugs, I think, should absolutely happen as soon as possible. 76% of people polled by the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group found that, so that's 3 in 4, found that the current approach isn't working, criminalisation is not working. The public agree on this. This is not a political hot potato as it used to be. Cannabis legalisation and regulation has over 50% of public support. There isn't evidence based to that. We should be following Canada. Of course, we shouldn't be advertising this. We should have an age limit, but we can remove child access by doing that. The stats have been really good up until this point. We talked about heroin-assisted treatment. I think that should work for the most severely addicted because it takes away from criminal gangs and the dealers that exist. And expansion of money for treatment. We've cut treatment far too much, so we need to have wraparound care.
Okay,
And
Peter.
thank you. Peter, there you go. That's Ant's summary of what he'd like to see happen, and the opinion of VoltFast, the drugs, what do you call it?
Think tank.
Well, he hasn't,
what about you?
He hasn't listened to what I've said. But the
But
drug
have you listened to what he said? What we want you to do is respond to what he's saying, that his
he isn't saying anything. He's just regurgitating the same old mantra of drug legalization. Prohibition, banning drugs hasn't worked, therefore what we must do is legalize them. This is, they say, non sequitur and rubbish. I've tried to introduce into this debate a number of facts, researched over many years, and indeed to be found in my book, The War We Never Fought, about what is actually going on, what actually happened. We have been in this country engaged in a half-century experiment in drug decriminalisation, and the reason why London stinks of marijuana is precisely because of that. I have demonstrated quite clearly by mentioning 2 important and civilised societies that a different policy is both possible and effective. My opponent doesn't care to engage with that because he knows it's true and he doesn't want to say so. The issue of mental illness, I think one day all those who belittle this will deeply, deeply regret, in profound shame, the way in which they did this. They're terribly comparable to the defenders of big tobacco in the 1950s and early 60s, who I remember because I'm old enough, claiming for years and years and years that cigarettes were not really harmful and that it would be all right if people smoked them, or that it was only people who were predisposed. How anybody knows they're predisposed to mental illness as a result of using marijuana, I don't know. There isn't any way of finding out. Those who are or are not predisposed, if they become mentally ill after using it, will be mentally ill to the ruin of themselves and their own families. And if you doubt any of this, then the work of Professor Sir Robin Murray, probably the most distinguished psychiatrist in the field in this country, at the Maudsley Hospital in London, is worth consulting. He is increasingly amazed at the complacency of people about the use of this drug. I really do think that anybody seriously proposing, particularly as GB News does, to be some kind of conservative media, should not treat the arguments of irresponsible people trying to make dangerous drugs more easily available as an equal to the arguments of those trying to prevent this from happening. I really don't think they are equal positions. As it is, this seems to be the way that it goes. I'll take any opportunity to say this that I can get. But the fact is that I don't find that in most media organizations there's much sympathy for the view which is in fact that taking the side of most people who fear greatly, particularly the parents of children who start using drugs, who fear greatly the ruin of family life and hope which results from that.
Well, how do you answer that? The fact that drugs do tear through families. They,
Absolutely.
As much as you might say that decriminalisation of possession is a good thing, I mean, that's just going to enable people to carry on taking drugs, even if the sale of them is, illegal. And it does have massive effects on people's health, their welfare, their families, their support networks.
Well, I think people are going to use drugs for reasons we've talked about, such as trauma or mental health issues, or just recreationally, whether you ban a substance or not. You can make people much safer through good regulations that we've discussed and through decriminalisation of possession. Some of those drug deaths, for example, people wouldn't have gone to hospital because they were too scared of the consequences of having an illegal substance. That wouldn't happen if a substance was decriminalised. I accept that, drugs are harmful, of course they are. I'm not irresponsible, I'm not stupid, I'm not saying that is the case, but it is safer if we can get a grip on this. Currently, we can...
So the idea of the criminalising, or the possession being a criminal offence, means these people end up in police cells or police stations, then just essentially get a record and are regurgitated.
Yeah.
But it's not actually enabling them to access services.
No, and there's other ways of doing it as well. So diversion schemes exist whereby, and this is the same in Portugal, it's not just we'll take it off you and be on your way. You're put through, a drug education class. If you're deemed to be a problematic substance user, then you're offered treatment. You have to go through, a couple of rings to ensure that people understand it's a serious, there are consequences to it. But putting people in custody, there's evidence to show that regurgitates cycles of crime. It tends to target the most poor and most vulnerable in society. Those figures actually were significantly worse among poorer cohorts of people and significantly worse in poorer parts of the country, such as the northeast of England. So there is a class thing there as well.
Right. And Peter,
Thank you
both. That was a lively debate. Thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Your time,
That's all we've got time for, Peter.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Yeah, we
could have gone on all day,
we are limited when we dedicate a whole 3 hours to this topic. We will, of course, invite Peter back on.
We're going to need drugs.
We appreciate Peter's view, and many people have that viewpoint, so it's good to have him on. And we did give him as much as we could.
Yeah, and we want to hear your views on this. We know it's a controversial subject, so please do get in touch. gbviews@gbnews.uk. You know the address by now.
Yeah. Now let's talk about one of those rules for some of us when we've been to a party. You remember those early days of going out